sure you got a Bible. If you didn't get one yet, you're going to need it today. We're actually going to read through parts of Daniel. But before I need to adjust the volume. Clipping. Before we get into Daniel chapter 2, I want to give a little bit more history so that we have context. That's me. All right. So, one of the things we talked about last week was the historical context for Daniel, and I'll do a quick kind of recap, especially if you weren't there. This is very pertinent information. So, when we look at Daniel, we're essentially looking at two different pieces of work. So again, chapters 2 through 6 were originally written in Aramaic, which is unique. It's totally unique out of the entire Hebrew Bible. That's the only actual piece of scripture we get in the entire Bible that originates in Aramaic. And 2 through 6 are all stories that date from the beginning of, the end of the kingdom of Judah, entering into the beginning of the exile in Babylon. We'll talk about that in a little bit. 8 through 12 is a portion of Daniel that is written sometime in the 2nd century, so in the 150s. And it is theoretically dated, the text itself dates it in the same time period as chapters 2 through 6, but in and of itself, it's an allegory for things that are happening during the 2nd century. Now, keep in mind that when we talk about this kind of like historical, critical reading of Daniel, that you will get people for whom that's very challenging, especially more conservative or fundamentalist aspects of Christianity will hold that Daniel was a real person that existed and wrote all these things in the 6th century, and we just happen to get copies of them in the 2nd century. However, that takes Daniel out of context to a certain extent, which I'll talk about in a second. But again, one of the most important things that we always have to ask is, who is the audience, right? Who is the audience? In other words, who is this work written to, written for, and when is that audience existing? So, I'm going to give you a quick history of that region and what is happening during the time in which Daniel was written. First of all, let's talk empires. So, what we refer to as the Babylonian Empire controls that region from around, for a long time, but the pertinent time period is the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar II. Hopefully a name that is relatively familiar. Nebuchadnezzar was the name of the ship, not really a spaceship, it's complicated. I'm not going to get into the full context of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is the longest reigning king of kings of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He is the son of Nabopolassar, who was king of Babylon from around 626 to 605. Nebuchadnezzar takes over the rule of Babylon in 605, and he lasts all the way up until, I think, 560 something. Might even be 560 itself. 564, I think it was, when he dies. What's interesting then is there's a series of very short-lived rulers that follow up after Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's son, Marduk. Marduk is the name of the god of the Babylonians. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar's son, Marduk, takes over. He is usurped in 562, something like that, maybe 560, by a guy named, hold on, I'm going to forget all these names. It's not really important because this guy only reigns for 1 year. There we go. Believe it or not, there's an extremely long list of dynasties in Babylon. Because the Babylonian dynasty exists as far back as 1500 BCE. So they're around for a while. And then even after the end of this Babylonian dynasty, they still continue to reign kind of in name in Babylon. When Cyrus comes through and conquers Babylon and its surrounding area, he essentially puts in a Babylonian to rule in Babylon, which is a smart thing to do if you don't want to have to deal with uprisings and whatnot. And these are some fantastic names. Okay, so I was 2 years off. So 562 is when Nebuchadnezzar dies. Marduk takes over. He only reigns for 2 years, and then he is usurped by Nebuchadnezzar. Again, not our language. Yeah, right? Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar is theoretically the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar II. And when I say theoretically, a lot of these folks that are usurping thrones and taking over are claiming connection to important kings, but the historicity of that is really tough to verify. And it's something that happens pretty commonly, is that if you want legitimacy in the empire on the throne, you say, well, I'm the great-grandson of so-and-so, right? And that automatically gives you some authority. So he reigns for 2 years, Marduk reigns for 2 years, Nebuchadnezzar reigns for 4 years, until 556 BCE. 556, when...
Kind of like people on the Mayflower.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, that's actually a really good comparison. Labashi Marduk. And again, if you really want to be important, you put your god's name on yours. To give you more legitimacy. He doesn't make it he'll reign for about 4 months until he is then usurped by a guy named Nabonidus. You don't have to remember any of these. And Nabonidus reigns then for the second longest reign. He reigns from 556 to 539, which is when Cyrus comes through, conquers Babylon, and kills Nabonidus. Okay, so why am I telling you all this? Well, I'm telling you all this because when we read chapters 2 through 6, we're going to hear this happened during the second year of the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar II. And there's one idiosyncrasy, which is, I think it's in chapter 4 or 5. It makes reference to, this is completely wrong. It's not Nabonidus. Last guy is Belshazzar. Yes, Belshazzar. And this is, okay, we'll talk about this guy in a second. Okay, there's an idiosyncrasy in Daniel where it refers to King Darius the Mede. And theoretically, Darius is the king that reigns between these guys and Cyrus. Here's the problem. There is zero historical record that Darius actually exists as a human being. And the reign of Belshazzar/Nabonidus butts right up against Cyrus. There's literally zero space for Darius to have existed. And again, I'm not trying to poke holes in the historicity of Daniel, but I'm trying to give us some insight as to what is going on when they're writing this down. And the question that is burning in my brain is, when they were recording this or writing this in the 150s, is it simply that they didn't get the history right? They didn't have the reigns lined up? Because there is a Darius. Darius is the fourth ruler of the Achaemenid Empire, which is established by King Cyrus. But that's many, many years after Daniel would have been alive. So when we talk about the chronology of Daniel, you have to understand that the chronology is very internal. In other words, it exists only within the narrative of Daniel. We're going to talk about that in a second as well. The reason this is important is Daniel talks about the reign of King Belshazzar. Belshazzar was never actually king. Nabonidus is Belshazzar's dad. Belshazzar helps foment the rebellion, the uprising that puts Nabonidus on the throne. Nabonidus reigns in name, but in effect, Belshazzar is actually the power behind the throne. And it actually lists Nabonidus and Belshazzar as effective co-rulers, but also a woman named Nitocris, who was also a person of important power. This is the time period in which Daniel 2 through 6 effectively exists. But specifically, Daniel exists during this time period. Okay, so we're going to talk about the second year of the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, and an important date to keep in mind is 586-7, which is when Nebuchadnezzar destroys Judah, wipes out Jerusalem, and exiles the people into Babylon. And I misrepresented this a little bit last week because, in fact, the stories that take place in 2 through 6 happen before the exile. Okay? So when we read chapter 1 last week, it talks about the second year of the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, blah, blah, blah. Theoretically, what happens is before we get the final conflict where the temple is destroyed and people are placed into exile, Nebuchadnezzar is already making overtures to Judah. And again, we talked about the fact that Judah during that time period exists kind of as a proxy in between Babylon / Assyria. This is a very rudimentary map, by the way, and Egypt in the southwest. How do you spell Egypt? Egypt in the southwest. And what happens is Nebuchadnezzar wins a really important battle over Egypt, which kind of sets Egypt on its heels. And the Israelites, the Judeans, are playing Egypt and Babylon against each other, and effectively they pick the wrong side. They back the wrong horse, which ticks Nebuchadnezzar off. But as early as 603, which is theoretically the year that these stories begin to take place in, Nebuchadnezzar is already establishing relations with Judah, and so he takes these young men whose original names are converted to Babylonian names, which is where we get Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, takes them back to Babylon to train them in the courtly ways of Babylon, that they might serve as go-betweens between Jerusalem, between Judah and Babylon. Make sense? Okay, forget all this. That's the context that those stories theoretically exist in. But here is the context. Here is the context that they are authored to. In other words, we know that Daniel is written in the middle of the 2nd century. I have to pull yet another reference because this is far too much for me to remember off the top of my head. I'm good with stories, not with names. Okay, we're now going to jump ahead a couple of empires. So Babylon was conquered. Yes, Linda.
You said the 2nd century BC?
BCE, yeah, BCE, around the 150s. Nebuchadnezzar, Babylonian Empire, conquered then by Cyrus II, who is the first king of kings of the Achaemenid Empire, or we might call them the Persians. That reign lasts up until Alexander the Great sweeps through, ahead of this gigantic army of Greeks, but starts with the Macedonians, thank you. Macedonians that comes through. Alexander dies prematurely. He leaves he doesn't leave it, but basically there are 4 different people that kind of take over in the wake of his death. They divide up the empire into 4 pieces. That lasts for a little bit of time until a guy named Seleucus the first, and we call him Seleucus the first, sets up what is then called the Seleucid Empire, which is effectively Greek rule, Greek and Macedonian rule, that lasts up until 153, 154 BCE, when then the Romans come through and reconquer the territory. And again, last week we talked about the effects of transformation and trauma on the people of Israel, or the people of Judah, and we wondered about what effect that might have on their well-being, their mental, space. but especially it affects how they understand who they are, right? Their identity, right? And that identity is very challenged because, they get basically wiped off the map in 587. Their temple gets torn asunder. They are taken from their homes, left in exile for 60 odd years, and then their temple is rebuilt by a foreigner, by Cyrus II, which is great. Nobody is looking that gift horse in the mouth. But then the rest of the history of Israel up until 150, and I would argue up through the end of the existence of Judah and Israel, is effectively being tossed back and forth between different powers, right? And you can track the different empires that come through. For the most part, the existence under the Seleucid Empire for the people of Judah is fairly good-ish, okay? And in fact, the story that I'm going to tell you in a second, which is very pertinent because it's the narrative into which Daniel is written, is effectively a victory for the Judeans. So, during the reign of the final Seleucid emperor Antiochus, there's a question of whether Judah, Israel, can become an official part of the empire. Up until this point, they've effectively just been a vassal state, meaning that they're not citizens, right? They're just a conquered territory. And what happens is there's a guy named Jason. Yes, ma'am.
How expansive is Judah? I mean, it's not just Jerusalem.
It's not expansive at all. Well, this is Palestine during Judges. Let me take this off real quick. And this is the Holy Land. So when we're talking about Judah, we have Jerusalem down here. When the empire is divided post King Solomon, the division is, again, it's not marked on this map because it's a different map, effectively from where modern Tel Aviv is across. So Judah was relatively tiny. Again, it's effectively what was the territory of the tribe of Judah back in the day. They absorbed Benjamin into their territory after Judges 19, after the conquest of the tribe of Benjamin by the other tribes. They absorbed that territory, which is where they actually get Jerusalem in the first place. But so, if we're talking about geographical area, it's this.
So basically, Jerusalem south.
Yes. However, after the restoration of Israel by Cyrus, and you don't quote me on this because actually this is a really interesting question which I might do some research on. They effectively regained most of the territory that was the kingdom of Israel prior to its split. So by the time you get Israel being a Roman territory, it exists all the way up to around here because it's including the Sea of Galilee, right? Because that's where Jesus is born. Jesus is born in Nazareth, which is right around here. Okay. Does that track? Does that answer your question, Linda? Yeah. I'm just going to take this off.
It's just because every time you say Judah, you say Jerusalem, and I'm going, it's got to be a bigger territory.
It is a bigger territory than that. And I'm very intentionally saying Judah because, again, when the kingdom is split after the death of Solomon, Judah is the southern territory, Israel is the northern territory. And effectively, Israel is the new Israel, right? Judah remains Judah because King Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, was a jerk. And so Jeroboam, who is the newly anointed king of Israel, takes over for everything else. But that's a different story. Okay, so Jason. Jason is a man of means. He's a wealthy Judean living in the middle of the 2nd century, and he bribes the heck out of Antiochus. Specifically, that Antiochus would make him high priest. Okay? Now keep in mind, high priest is not simply a religious role. As high priest, Jason effectively becomes kind of the de facto governor of Judah, right? So he gets a pretty good deal on this. The problem is Jason isn't the only man of means, and a guy named Menelaus, Menelaus gives Antiochus more money. And so Antiochus removes Jason from the role of high priest, installs Menelaus as high priest, and effectively reverts all of the attempted changes that Jason was trying to make. One of the major changes that Jason effectively lobbied for as high priest was the incorporation of Judah, of Israel, into the Seleucid Empire as citizens of the empire. And by and large, this was a very popular thing during this time. The Judeans loved it because it gave them rights and privileges which heretofore did not exist for them. And by and large, Jason was celebrated as a good dude, okay? Despite the fact that he effectively bought the position. Yes?
How did they get around the requirement of the law that it be genetic, or passed down through the Kohanim? Because the law says it has to come down. Understand? How did they get around? I mean, even getting bribed, like it's just because they rebuilt the temple, they're like, oh, you get a pass on that, or did they kind of like, you know?
Well, but they're not. But the Judeans are being incorporated into the Seleucid
Okay,
system.
that's what I'm saying. So they effectively, you have the state kind of dictating the religion.
Yes.
Okay, now I just want to make sure that.
Well, and this is really important to understand because even though Jason is popular and that being incorporated as a citizen of the Seleucid Empire is popular during that time period, once we get to the Maccabean revolt, all this stuff gets and it's part of the grievances that the Maccabees are holding against it. But this is what begins this, right? So Menelaus bribes Antiochus, he gets installed, and then there's a series of unfortunate events where Antiochus goes to fight a battle in Egypt. He's not heard from, it's assumed that he's killed. Jason sees this as an opportunity to claim back the role of high priest for Menelaus. He leads an armed revolt into Jerusalem, finds out that Antiochus, in fact, is not dead and is in Jerusalem. And Antiochus is like, no we don't. And so what happens then is Antiochus puts down the revolt and totally wipes out all the privileges that were given to the Judeans and removes the worship of God from the temple. And in fact installs, I think it's Jupiter as the new, sets up a statue of Jupiter in the temple space. This is then what leads to the Maccabean revolt, which is a 3-year war in which the Maccabees effectively win, right? And are able to reinstall the worship of God into the temple. Everything's great. Too bad the Romans come through. Not long after this, reconquer the territory. But the status quo kind of exists up through the reign of Jesus because you still have Jewish rulers, Herod the Great being a prime example of that, who are cooperating with the Roman state in order to, affect the well-being of their people. But this is when Daniel is written, during all of this conflict. And most scholars hold that when Daniel is finished, we do not yet see the Maccabean revolt. So that the outcome of all this stuff is still up in the air, right? Whether or not they are going to be able to reclaim the temple, whether or not they are going to get out from under the thumb of this guy. This is the setting into which this work of prophecy is being dictated, for lack of a better word. Does that track? You understand? So the question that we need to be thinking about, right, is what are the things that people need to hear? What are the stories that need to be told that are going to provide comfort and hope to a people who find themselves in a very conflicting and a very scary time period, right? Because, again, think about the trauma now of losing access once again to the temple. The same temple that was destroyed, rebuilt, and now we've lost access to it. They even worse than destroying it, they effectively converted it to the worship of a foreign religion, right? So just, I want you to think about that as we're reading through this. This is the audience that Daniel is written to. Whether we're talking about 2 through 6 or whether we're talking about 8 through 12, notice I'm not mentioning books 1 and 7 because 2 through 6 is the original that's written in Aramaic. 1 and 7 are attached later as kind of an intro and outro for 2 through 6. And then 8 through 12, which is written in Hebrew. Good God, my handwriting is bad. Comes not much, it comes later, right? But 8 through 12 especially, even though the text tells you during the second year of the reign of Belshazzar, etc., which is way back in 540s, right? In actuality, the situation that the text is speaking to, or the audience that is reading this, is receiving consolation about what's happening during all of this. Does that track? Does that make sense? Let me give you a comparison. How many of you are Superman fans? Yeah, okay. Maybe not the right demographic. But Superman, where does the Superman narrative come out of? It comes out of the 1930s and 1940s. And I'm not going to give you the specific history. I'm not that much of a comic book geek that I can tell you all the details. But it comes out of an era of conflict and strife, right? And in fact, in the early issues of Superman, who's the main antagonist that Superman is fighting? Nazis. Superman gains popularity because over the course of World War II, you are pitting, the ultimate good. And again, the character of Superman is a very not so subtle Jesus analog to a certain extent, right? I mean, insofar as that, he's dropped off on this planet. His parents aren't actually his parents. He's got all of these, overwhelming powers, and he's a force for good. He never sins. That would not be Superman. But we're still using Superman, 60 years later. In fact, there was just a new movie that came out that I watched on flight flight to France. I watched the latest Superman movie. It was okay. It was a little too on the nose, but that's a different story. But this is how we take stories, we take ideas, we take characters, and use them in our fleshing out, our working out of the conflicts that are occurring in our time period. We can still take a character like Superman and have him fighting modern heroes or modern villains, right? So we've got Lex Luthor in his 15th incarnation in the latest movie, still working out issues because a couple of the themes that pop up in the new Superman movie is the concept of being an alien, right? And whether or not aliens are welcome on Earth, and of course it's not so subtle reference to our current conflict around immigration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is kind of how I want you to think about the character of Daniel, right? Whether or not Daniel as a human being exists, the stories of Daniel are prevalent throughout Hebrew writing. I mentioned that there are stories of Daniel that exist in Ezra and a couple of other books in the Hebrew Bible. But there are stories of Daniel which we can trace as far back as the Ugarites, which was a population that existed prior to the worship of Yahweh. Way back. We're talking second millennium BCE. So this idea of this person exists. And so what's happening in the book of Daniel is we're taking these stories and this character and using them to comment on or give hope to or inspiration during this conflict. Does that track? Does that make sense? Okay. Let's read. Let's actually read it. Okay, so pull up Daniel chapter 2. And one last preface, which is going to be the bane of your existence. These are just fun stories too. And in fact, I mentioned last week that when we get to Daniel and or the fiery furnace, that's a story that we read during Easter Vigil. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. How many of you have fond memory of Daniel and the lion's den growing up? Yeah, it's a story we all grew up with. First, we're going to talk about Daniel interpreting dreams. Quick pop quiz. Who else is a very famous dream interpreter in the Hebrew canon? Joseph, right? Interpreting Pharaoh's dreams in the lead up to the Hebrew people's enslavement in Egypt. Okay, I'll just start reading. We'll read through it, and then we'll pop to the next one. In the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So, 604, 603 BCE, something like that. Nebuchadnezzar dreamed such dreams that his spirit was troubled and his sleep left him. Remind you of anything, right? This is a story that we've heard before. Pharaoh had the dream about the 7 cows and the 7 stalks of grain, so much so that he is unable to sleep and searches nonstop for somebody who can interpret dreams for him. So this is, again, it's maybe an intentional correlation. So the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, and I had to laugh at this. I'm like, so we've got a list of magic users. Were the Chaldeans themselves in that same list, or is this just a bad use of the Oxford comma? I don't know. And the Chaldeans we summoned to tell the king his dreams. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had such a dream that my spirit is troubled by the desire to understand it. The Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will reveal the interpretation. The king answered the Chaldeans, This is a public decree. If you do not tell me both the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb. Whew. And your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you do tell me the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. They answered a second time, Let the king first tell his servants the dream, and then we can give its interpretation. The king answered, I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time because you see the decree from me is firm. If you do not tell me the dream, there is but one verdict for you. You have agreed to speak lying and misleading words to me until things take a turn. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king, There is no one on earth who can reveal what the king demands. In fact, no king, however great and powerful, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king is asking is too difficult, and no one can reveal it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with mortals. Okay, did you track what's happening here? So the king has a dream. He wants somebody to interpret it, but in order that he can trust that they can actually interpret it, he wants them to tell his own dream to them. Okay? He wants them to literally read his mind. And so here are these poor folks that have been summoned, told that if they can't interpret the dream, he's going to rip them apart and destroy their houses, which is their families. And the king is effectively asking them to mind read, right? And they're like, nobody can do it. A category of wise men simply by association, even though they had not participated in this whatsoever. Then Daniel responded with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the king's chief executioner, who had gone out to execute the wise men of Babylon. He asked Arioch, the royal official, Why is the decree of the king so urgent? Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. So Daniel went in and requested that the king give him time, and he would tell the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his home and informed his companions Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, a.k.a. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, of the matter, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the... Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven. This is Daniel's prayer. Daniel said, Blessed be the name of God from age to age, for wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons, deposes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. To you, O God of my ancestors, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power, and you have now revealed to me what we asked of you, for you have revealed to us what the king ordered. And then finally, Daniel interprets the dream. Therefore, Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king of Babylon, and said to him, Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will give the king the interpretation. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man... Okay, quick pause. Again, historicity in trouble. Because this is during the second year of the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar II. There has been no exile from Jerusalem yet. We're about 13, 14, 15 years ahead of that. And all I gotta say is just like, relax your brains a little bit. What the author is doing is placing this narrative within context. We in the 21st century are very anxious about getting dates and times right. The people who were writing Daniel weren't so much. They were more concerned about placing the narrative of Daniel within a certain time period, if that makes sense. Okay, does that track? We can talk more about that later if we need to.
Well, somewhere in here it says Daniel and his friends switched to just eating vegetables and drinking water.
That was chapter 1. And again, okay, this is an identity piece, right? Because what happens is Daniel and his friends are brought to Babylon, and they're told, you have to eat the food that we eat. And it doesn't say it specifically, but we're given to understand that whatever the Babylonians are eating would violate what we refer to as kosher laws. They would violate the dietary restrictions of Daniel and his friends. And so what Daniel and his friends do, there's this wonderful argument where the Babylonians are like, listen, if you don't eat what we eat, you're going to get weak and die. In other words, eat some, I don't know what they're, presumably it's pork products or shellfish or something like that. So eat what we eat, otherwise you're going to wither and die. And Daniel and his friends eat vegetables and other stuff and manage to put on weight relative to the Babylonians.
Maybe he thought the dreams would be more clear to him.
Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, or
Daniel.
We're getting there.
The vegetable.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Getting there. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who can tell the king the interpretation. The king said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, again this is the Babylonian name that's given to Daniel, are you able to tell me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered the king, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or diviners can show to the king the mystery that the king is asking, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has disclosed to King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen at the end of days. Your dreams of your head as you lay in bed were these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be hereafter, and the revealer of mysteries disclosed to you what is to be. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me because of any wisdom that I have more than any other living being, but in order that the interpretation may be known to the king and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. A quick pause again. This phrase, end of days, is one which proponents of rapture theology and or 17th century dispensationalists glam onto, right? And point out, well, it says right here that what the book of Daniel is about interpreting what's going to happen at the end of days. Because what we're going to have here is Daniel just told the king, well, the dreams that you're having, which I'm about to tell you, are dreams that are about days. Here's the thing, though. Which end? Right? When you take this out of its context, which is what happens when you pair Daniel with Revelation and try to use it to predict the future, you're again removing it from the story in which it exists. The end of days he's referring to is the end of Babylon. Okay? And then the end of Babylon, then the end of the Greeks, and then the end of the Seleucids, etc., which we're going to hear in a second. Theoretically. You were looking, O king, and there appeared a great statue. That statue was huge, its brilliance extraordinary, it was standing before you, and its appearance frightening. The head of that statue was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its midsection and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Again, kind of impossible, but that's not the point. As you looked on, a stone was cut out, not by human hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken in pieces and became like the chaff crushing the floors. But the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. What did the king eat before he went to bed? That was the dream. Now we will tell the king's interpretation. So Daniel fulfills the expectation, which is he tells the king's dream to him without having heard it. You, O king, the King of Kings, is really melting it here. To whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the might, and the glory, sound familiar? Into whose hands he has given human beings wherever they live, the wild animals of the field and the birds of the air, whom he has established as ruler over them all. You are the head of gold. After you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the whole earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron, just as iron crushes and smashes everything, it shall crush and shatter all these. As you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom, but some of the strength of iron shall be in it, as you saw the iron mixed with the clay. And as the toes of the feet were part iron and part clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. And as you saw the iron mixed with clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall his kingdom be left to another people. It shall crush all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from the mountain, not by hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has informed the king what shall be hereafter. The dream is certain, and its interpretation true. trustworthy. And I'll finish this out and then we can go back and talk about it. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, worshipped Daniel, and commanded that a grain offering and incense be offered him. The king said to Daniel, truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and the revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king promoted Daniel, gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel remained at the king's court. Okay. So, Wayne, go for it.
They talk about the Iron Age, Bronze Age.
Could be. I mean, those are, the segregation of ages of technological development into iron rods, etc., are come about at a much later period. That's a modern thing. But okay, we just talked about where's my marker in my pocket? Okay. So Daniel says, who's the head of gold? Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. This is an interpretation. Okay? I am not telling you this is the mystery, and I'm not telling you I'm going to give you the answer, okay? But again, Daniel, written middle of the 2nd century, into the context that we talked about with Jason and Antiochus and Melanias, whatever his name is. A time of great uncertainty, a time where they've lost access to the temple, a time where they're feeling that their religion would acquire people, with their ability to practice their faith is being suppressed, okay? And Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream, okay? And Nebuchadnezzar is the gold head with the silver, and then we've got the silver torso, bronze, whatever, and then we've got the iron and clay, right? So keep in mind, when Daniel is written, there's no Roman Empire yet, okay? This is an interpretation. This is my interpretation, and other people's. But what Daniel is effectively saying to Nebuchadnezzar is, the end is going to happen to you. And then there's going to be another kingdom, and then another kingdom, and then another kingdom. But notice, at the end of it, what does Daniel promise? That there's going to be a kingdom which is established, which lasts forever and ever, amen. Okay? Now here's the problem. For us reading this in the 21st century, that doesn't happen. Okay? Because we know that what happens is the Romans take over from the Seleucids, and the Romans rule the Near East up until 4th century, 5th century Common Era, after which the Roman Empire crumbles. And the Hebrew people go into diaspora, thank you, whoever said it. They go into diaspora and don't effectively return to the land that they are promised until 1946, right? Well, yeah, sort of. It's complicated. Okay? We know that, 2,000 years later. But in 153 or 154, whenever Daniel is quote unquote published, the people that are hearing this are worried that they're never going to be able to be a kingdom again, right? They're under the power of this king, right? Which is, if we're tracking the kingdoms in the dream, okay? And they're worried that their future is nil, uncertain. Again, for all the aforementioned reasons, not having control of the temple, being yet a vassal to yet another power. And so what this dream, what this message of hope is speaking, is hope into that situation, saying, no, this empire too shall come to an end. Just like the Babylonian Empire came to an end, just like the Persian Empire came to an end, etc., 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 etc. This empire too shall come to an end. And there will be a day when, the new kingdom. Okay, now here's the thing. Daniel is written for that context. The operative question is, what can we get out of it? Okay, as with all things, what inspiration, information from Scripture can we get? Okay, let me ask the question: and again, I don't want to get into modern politics. Is it important that reigns and administrations eventually go away, whether they're good or not? Yes. Okay. As Christians, do we not? And again, the people that were reading this weren't Christian; they were Jewish. Okay. But as Christians, do we not hold as part of our theology, part of our belief, that there will be someday, somehow, the eternal reign of the kingdom of God? Yes. Okay? So, can we still read Daniel, understanding that Daniel was written for specific people at a specific time period, but we can still take meaning from this? Absolutely. Okay? In fact, this is going to be part of the sermon this morning. It's talking about Christ as King. Right? Christ as King. What does that mean for us? What do you think? Sorry, I'm just talking. Warren.
So I think the lesson that I take from this is that our God,
Yeah.
who's the same God as the Jewish God,
Yep. At least in our understanding, yeah.
has been around for longer than we know
And has been ending empires.
and will be here forever.
And this is exactly what I think you're hitting at the core of what the message of I think the entirety of the book of Daniel is getting at, is that God outlasts whatever, right? God has been, will be, and no matter where we find ourselves, whether we find ourselves under the thumb of an oppressive ruler who's taken away our ability to practice our faith in the house that we created for it, or whether it's an administration, or we're living under a despot in Russia or China or whatever, that God is the God of eternity and will preside over the end of that empire as well too. Yeah, I think you're on it. And so when we get to 8 through 12, where it's not just these individual stories, where we get kind of this narrative of good versus evil and the end of things, that this is exactly what the authors are trying to communicate, right? They are giving that reminder and that hope into the context in which they're writing this book. And and again, this is a very kind of historical critical reading of it, but they're using the character of Daniel to tell that narrative, if that makes sense. Daniel, who is celebrated in Hebrew canon as being a figurehead or an important figure who is victorious against the powers of evil, if that makes sense. I'm sorry if I'm breaking your brains a little bit here. We got 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Let's hop to Daniel chapter 3. This is one of my favorite parts of Daniel, because it is it's so stereotypical of people in authority that they don't learn the lessons that we try to teach them. So King Nebuchadnezzar has this dream about the statue, right? And Daniel says, "You're the golden head." Okay, and Daniel is theoretically telling Nebuchadnezzar about the end of his empire, right? Like Nebuchadnezzar, I hate to break it to you, this is going to happen. Nebuchadnezzar in one ear, out the other, because what does Nebuchadnezzar do? He builds a giant golden statue. So King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits. This is gigantic. By the way, 60 cubits, I can't remember the cubit to be.
I think it's considered 18 inches. It's pretty much
Yeah.
It's a foot and a half.
I think, yeah.
Pinky to elbow.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's not, we don't have a standard measure.
There's no,
roughly.
what's the name of the organization that verifies it?
It's like metric standards.
Yeah.
It's European. We don't care.
Yeah. Centimeters, meters. So imagine, if we're talking 18 inches, 60 cubits is 90 feet, right? That's a big statue. All made out of gold. Okay. 60 cubits, and whose width was 6 cubits. I guess the ratios make sense. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent for the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had had set up. This is one of the reasons that this is such a fun story to read, especially during Easter Vigil, is because it's poetic. I love the list of things. So, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, all the officials of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. When they were standing before the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship. Trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, all the peoples, nations, and languages, fell down and worshipped the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Accordingly, at this time, certain Chaldeans came forward and denounced the Jews. Chaldeans is a synonym for Babylonians-ish. I'm not going to get into inter-Babylonian ethnicities, but just to clarify that. They ratted out Daniel effectively. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble shall fall down and worship the golden statue." When you read this at Easter Vigil, the lector can make a big deal of repeating this. Harp, lyre, trigon, blah, 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 blah. And whoever does not follow and worship shall be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the golden statue that you have set up. Okay, so just a quick note on this. And I might be reading in between the lines a little too much here. I think that they're afraid of Daniel, right? Daniel has been appointed effectively governor of Babylon, the city, and they don't want to attack Daniel himself, so they're going after his compatriots. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in, so they brought those men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods and you do not worship the golden statue that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you should fall down and worship the statue that I have made." So I love this scene. So he calls these guys in. They've been ratted out by the Chaldeans, right? These guys aren't falling down and worshiping. And he calls them in and he's like, "I'm going to give you a chance. You do it right here. We're going to be good." So he sets up, and I'm picturing the image of this entire orchestra that's arrayed for this specific purpose, right? For this specific purpose. And again, here's my math brain. How many times a day was this? Like, how often were they, did he just have this orchestra on staff, right? Or did he hand out instruments like you do for a kid's service? And like, okay, who's playing the trigon today? I don't know. The text doesn't give. Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, entire musical ensemble, you should fall down and worship the statue that I have made. Okay, sure. I don't think you crafted it. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hand? This is such a great setup. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face was distorted. He ordered the furnace heated up 7 times more than was customary. So, get it even hotter than it normally is. And ordered some of the strongest guards in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound, still wearing their tunics, their trousers, their hats, their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the furnace of blazing fire. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly. He said to his counselors, "Was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire?" They answered the king, "True, O king." He replied, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the 4th has the appearance of a god." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, prefects, the governors, the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of his men. The hair of their heads was not singed, the tunics were not scorched, not even the smell of fire came from them. Nebuchadnezzar said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree: any nation, people, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, a popular punishment apparently, and their house laid in ruin, for there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Do I hear Sunday school,
I
please?
hear children.
Okay.
Here they come. Here they come.
Oh boy, what do you have to share with us?
You want to take the mic? You want me to say? You want us? Okay. Today we celebrated Christ the King, as it's the last Sunday in Pentecost. So we remembered all the wonderful things that Jesus has done for us. In September, is Christ like a normal king? Why is he not like a normal king?
Because he's helpful.
Because he's helpful. So these are our crowns, and then our next thing that we talked about is we're moving into our season of hope and joy with the Advent coming next week. So we made Advent calendars, but not calendars. I keep on saying calendars, and the kids are getting so excited. Wreaths. I know. Sorry, can I? So do you want to hold up? Yours is finished. We're going to go quickly finish the other ones. But we have ribbon.
You put purple on that side.
Yeah. Do you want to show yours, Alice, so you can?
Yeah, it said blue because it used to be blue. It was like it's rainbow, but I put it purple, but I just couldn't put blue, and I was gonna put blue too. Like just gonna put blue.
I get it.
So my rainbow's gonna be pink because you could do red and pink, orange, yellow, green, purple.
Awesome.
Right, you do.
MJ, did you want to say anything?
Mine is purple,
No, you just said.
red,
Yeah.
and purple.
Awesome. Thank you guys.
Thank you guys. With those names, I bet you can. Sorry, I just hope that you understood that Alice wanted to do the rainbow, like Reggie Bibb, but she had to make sacrifices because they didn't have red or blue, so she had to do pink instead of red, and she's going to do purple instead of red. Okay, we'll wrap up here. We'll talk more about this story next week, but I just want to, again, thinking about the context of that second century, can you imagine or understand how this narrative might speak directly to the cares and concerns of the Jewish people? Again, who have had a statue to Jupiter set up in the Holy of Holies, right? So can you see the correlation here between the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego standing firm in their faith in the face of basically somebody telling them, no, you can't, right? You've got the correlation between the statues, and then also you've got the fourth person who looks like a god. Here's where, as Christians, we're like, oh, it's Jesus. For the people that are hearing the story, this, as Warner was saying, is evidence of it is inspiration that even in the midst of a blazing furnace, God is there with you. God is in the midst of that. And so if we talk about that, metaphorically, this is something that we can look at and understand. Even in the midst of the worst of our suffering, we acknowledge that God is standing in solidarity, is with us in that suffering. So, thanks, folks. I promise next week we won't do the